So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. It is Jason Stahl. As a former member of a Hutterite colony, he remains deeply connected to its roots. And he brings thoughtful insight. He just finished a research project about the history and role of medicine among the Hutterites. Please, Jason, tell us the story.
Yes, as Sibylla just said, I just finished a master's thesis at the University of Hamburg. We have a special center there that focuses only on manuscripts, all kinds, from basically all over the world. And yeah, they really focus on the materiality of manuscripts, but I want to know what's inside, what's written. So that's what I focused on. And as it also says here, the medical part of it. We'll get into that. Okay. We already have heard a lot about the Moravian Anabaptists. We know what they were known for, and we think of them as these secluded enclaves sometimes. But I want to show as part of my presentation that they were part of larger intellectual networks. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about print culture, how that influenced them and how it shows up in their manuscripts. And then also how we can see through their medicine that they were part of larger networks as well, namely Paracelsianism. A final thing I'd like to show you is also maybe their relationship to the natural world. We think of them as these religious, maybe pious people, but I want to show that there might be a little bit more nuance to that story. Again, this is what they're usually known for and quite famous, but this presentation will focus more on their medical aspect. So the manuscripts that I looked at originated in Moravia. And yeah, they came out of these Hutterite communities who had what we would call Schreibstuben. So they had special places where they produced manuscripts. And let me go to the next slide to show you. Yeah, this is really what happened. Why we want to ask the question, why manuscripts in an age of printing? Printing was very popular at this time. So why would Hutterites go back and use a medieval form of writing, namely manuscripts, to produce texts? The problem that they ran into is they didn't have access necessarily to printing presses. As Anabaptists, they were forbidden to print books. And if a printer printed books for them, they commissioned a few of them, we know this, these printers got into serious trouble. So what did they do? They were innovative. Hutterites are great adapters. So they produced manuscripts that basically copied printed books. So if you remember nothing else today, look for these features in the manuscripts. When you look at a print book, we have a title page, we have prefaces. That's what I'm going to be showing you. They incorporated this into what you could call medieval manuscripts. Take a look at this. I have to give credit to Martin Rothkegel. He inspired my research and also helped me a great deal. And he, with Rauer in their catalog, says that there was this surge of manuscripts during this time period. And again, Kenny being the theologian. And so we have so many religious texts, right, that have been analyzed. And I'm like, I want a different view. I want something different. And what other material sources do we have? We have some medical manuscripts that are still extant. That's why I chose this, because for me, I've always sort of been interested in medicine, and this was a way to pursue this. So here are 3 different Hutterite medical manuscripts. What do you see here? You see them over various different time periods, but they have classic title pages at the beginning. When you open a medieval manuscript, oftentimes the text will begin right away. These are different, which makes sense. They were produced during the age of print, and other than that they were written by hand, they could have been a printed title page. The same goes for prefaces. Many of these books have prefaces at the beginning. Not only there, but often throughout the sections, you'll have a section being introduced by a preface that the author either wrote or copied from another text. They also include meticulously gathered indices, usually at the back, but these helped organize the book. And also, this, I would say, came about because of print, because many of the books that we find coming out at this time would have featured indices as well. So let me introduce to you Leonhardt Gagasser. He is the individual who we credit as the author of the text that I look at. Some of them were just copies, but the unfortunate thing is we know hardly anything about him. We looked at matriculation records because he had, medical knowledge. Could he have gone to some university to get that? And he appears nowhere. Somehow he must have appeared on the scene in Moravia and produced these texts, and he's not mentioned in das große Geschichtsbuch. We know basically nothing about him. A Gagasser was matriculated sometime in the middle of the 1500s in Vienna. Martinez was his name, but then he disappears from the record as well. The Gagasser name also appears somewhere in Styria. But again, we sort of lose the trail there, and we don't know if he somehow was related to them. But anyway, what we can tell is in one of his notes, he says that I practiced medicine for about 30 years. And from what I can gather, he would have probably been a barber surgeon versus a regular educated physician, because he was not afraid to get his hands dirty. More on that later. So there are approximately 14 manuscripts extant now all the way from Romania to Sweden to Bethesda in North America that have his name somewhere in the text, presumably as the author, but some of them could also be copies of one of the other texts. But we still credit, we say we have 14. The last two, Martin Rothkegel credits to Gagasser. However, his name does not appear inside the book itself. Yeah, Dolny Kubin. Again, this is Slovakia. And there's another one in Martin that I visited. So shout out to the Slovakians for this, for preserving them, of course. So in his Bucharest codex, he actually lists his personal library. So again, we're sort of traveling back in time to try and envision what did Hutterite communities look like in Moravia during this first century of their creation. So what this shows us, having 56 works of Paracelsus, this is one guy having all these books, shows us that he had access to intellectual networks. He wasn't just like an amateur who had one or two books on the shelf by Paracelsus. He had like a very large quantity. And I'll say more about that later, the Paracelsian part of his writings. So let's look at a case study, right? Let's dive in and see what one of them looks like. Classic Hutterite cover with the blind stamping. That's the embossing that you see. There are the four frames as well. This can all be seen in Rothkegel's catalog. I'm not going to get into it because this is all manuscript stuff. Very important, the year stamped into it, places it in the latter 1500s when the Hutterites this was, I would say, during the golden period still. Again, what also proves its Hutterite provenance is we see no animals or nothing depicted on the covers other than floral prints. And this is very typical Hutterite. They were not permitted to use anything that depicted a live image or like a living person or animal. Okay, this Leiden Codex also featured something that I saw in no other manuscript, and I've seen quite a quantity all over Europe. This included these little tabs that you see, which separated the sections. So he would write one section and then insert the tab. We didn't analyze this material, but it's presumably copper, according to the experts. uh, Again, you come upon these things that you're expecting a manuscript, but then it'll have just a pleasant surprise waiting for you, right? The other thing about this codex is the watermark on the paper. This also helps prove the provenance because you want to ask yourself, how do you know it's not a fake? How do you know somebody didn't create this? Yeah, even 200 or 300 years later. So there's a watermark on the page in there, and it places it in Praha, Prague. The paper was produced in Prague in 1580, which is right around the time that this manuscript, at least according to the stamp on the cover, was produced. So I had to get really good at reading the text, but again, it's very evident that it was not just written for one person. The text is easily readable by people who would have been exposed to it, which shows that these books were not only meant for one person's use, like one doctor making his own notes. They were created, we believe, to be handed down or passed on to junior surgeons. As young people were being trained for this profession, they were able to use these books. Just want to point out here, Nata, yeah, when there's like worms or you have a snake bite. The other one, von den stichenden Seiten. So, yeah, very common ailments that he would be addressing. The other thing about Gagasser's writing is he adopts this collegial tone. He doesn't write as if he's somebody superior, picture like a university professor dictating to pupils. No, he's talking to somebody as if they're in the room. And this is what he says here. I was finally moved to set down my knowledge so that it could be used by others. And he's also quite humble, I would say, at least in the second phrase, by saying, if there's somebody with better knowledge here, I want to hear it. I want to know what you have to say. This also appears very prominently throughout his writings, is these verb forms that includes willst du. It's not formal. And Hutterites are still use this to this day. We don't use the formal C at all. Like we don't grow up even knowing about that. And it's almost always this willst du, sollst du, magst du, hast du. And this features very prominently in his manuscripts. A shout out to Wilfried. So these Austrian and Bavarian terms also appear, of course, because they had such connections to Austria. Krähen, Nachtmahl, Milch, Salbe. These are all words that are featured in this region. So getting into the actual healing modalities, what appears are approaches to healing that were used at the time. Of course, the first one, bloodletting, that was still very prominently used. Baden, we know the Hutterites had these spas in Moravia. I have a bit more to say about that in a bit. Christian enemas, let's not go too deep into that. Dosages, plaster are also, these plasters that they would apply were also used quite prominently during this time. Okay, some rather exotic or unusual ingredients that I found that he had listed was mumia feist. This would be mummy fat. And at the time, people actually believed if you had some type of material from like Egyptian mummies, that they would have healing properties. The same goes for the second one, human fat. I'm not going to ask how they got this because this raises very questionable circumstances. And then also Tauben mist and dung, oxen mist. So this is dung that would have been used in a plaster externally to be applied, which I guess you could understand, but okay. Listen to this sleep listen to this sleep instruction that he has. He says that natural sleep should be 7 to 8 hours, but the first half of the night you should sleep on one side, and then the other half should be on the other side. And of course, don't sleep throughout the day because it's not good for your digestion. Oral hygiene. This is what I wanted to know about. That he would mention this as part of like a healthcare approach, saying that in the morning you're supposed to use vinegar to cleanse, like the mouth orifices and stuff. I found this really, really interesting. Okay, we can also see from his writing that the Hutterites believed that they lived in something of a promised land of Moravia. Not only did it give them a measure of religious freedom, but they also felt like if you read Rothkegel, he says they felt like place had been created for them for the end of time almost. And here he says about the plants that even grow here. He's very stolz drauf. He's very proud of what he can use for healing properties. And here he says, if the old ones would know what we have here, they would agree with me that their stuff is just not any good, especially because it has to travel over long distances to come to us. When it gets here, he says it's often moldy and just not usable for medicine. So in this Bratislava Codex, he lists which herbs to gather by month. This shows us the relationship to their natural world around them, that they were not, it actually also goes back to the Klostergarten, if you remember this term. These were these religious orders that had these herb gardens, and Hutterites, it seems like, had very much like the same thing. Basic ingredients in regional cooking. Now, this is where I get excited because I want to know what they ate, right? I want to know what they had access to during this time. So he lists, of course, herbs and roots and spices that they had available, even cinnamon and saffron, which shows that there was trade networks going on. What I was shocked by is 29 different varieties of fish. We know people had these dike, these reservoirs, of course, where they had freshwater fish, but this seems like a significant protein source to me. The same goes for the meat. They had access to not only beef and mm, also to wild game, and it's very obvious there that usually the nobility were the ones that had access to wild game. It was reserved for the nobility, but somehow Hutterites had access as well. So this shows us that they weren't like with the serfs, the lower level, they also weren't nobility, but they had this middle way of gaining access to material. And of course, they had to feed a lot of people. So that makes sense. So what I did in my research is I compiled these charts, which shows his spelling of the material that he used. And this would have been gathered in the month of August. And then I tried finding what that would be in German, and then in English, and also then the scientific spelling. So Gagasser's insight, this is also quite modern, if you ask me, the way he says this. When it comes to diet, he says there is not one size scheme fits all. He actually says you have to look at your patient and see what can they tolerate. One person can handle this and the other person can't. And that's, I would say, is a very modern approach to medicine, or maybe not modern. Let me say individual approach to medicine. Okay, recipes, right? Now we really get a sense of what at least people who were coming to be treated for illness or whatever would have had given to them for food. So oftentimes, as you can see, it's soups, but also salt porridges. So it's usually something soft, usually locally grown material ingredients. This again shows us, healing wasn't just a matter of giving them a tincture or giving them a purgative. It was comprehensive. Diet was part of their healing approach. This is just another, chart of the modern spellings of what they used for, these soft recipes that I was just telling you about. Palatable. Okay, I said something earlier about the spas that they had, and we've known this, right? This is common knowledge, but this manuscript or this part of the manuscript showed us how they actually went about that. So in this one manuscript, he says, yeah, take the herbs, put them in a cloth and boil them for a certain amount of time. But this is the fascinating piece. When you first enter the bath, don't go too deep. And you shouldn't eat or drink while you're in the bath as well. But notice what the underlined part, he says, you shouldn't sleep in the bath either, and nor should you be troubled by sadness, anger, envy, and other such emotions. So there's like a psychological piece to this that he's bringing in here as well. Okay, my time. So again, this is a religious community, but I only found a few references to God. So it shows that, of course, he was influenced by this, but it was not a great part of the healing process to say, like only God can heal. This was not, doesn't seem to be the approach. He was very pragmatic, very practical. And here he even says, I ask that he's compiled all this knowledge. He says, I ask that you take this as a token from me and serve the Lord in heaven with it until we reach our promised reward. So giving credit, the humility is also what I see here. He gives credit to some other Hutterite physicians that we know about. And here we go with the Paracelsian piece. So Paracelsus appears very prominently in these texts. Not only did he have significant books written by Paracelsus in his library, but what Gagasser, he had this skill of taking information, reading these texts and distilling it. So he read the Paracelsian texts and then he wrote a Hutterite text, if I can call it that, distilling only the important information that he felt he needed or that other younger physicians would need. And that's what he put down. So it's this synthesis of information. Very, very fascinating. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this as my conclusion. I'm going to leave you with this snake bite cure that he lists. And as a manuscriptologist, is Emmy here? Yeah? Okay. Look what he says. If you have a snake bite, give him some good writing ink mixed with good wine to drink, and that'll purge everything that is bad inside of the body. Okay, so in closing, I was not attempting to write a history of medicine. That's not what I was trying to do. Of course, I couldn't write his biography. I just couldn't find the sources about him. What I did find was cultural information about the Hutterites, how they would have lived during this first century in Moravia, a little bit about their food culture, their approaches to healing, how they went about healthcare, and also the broader intellectual networks that they were exposed to, not only from print culture, I tried showing that to you from the beginning, but also the Paracelsian networks that were sort of clandestine in Europe at the time. So yeah, that's what I've got for you.